Well, it's Monday, and we're in Acts 23, verses 12 through 22, and the poor Roman commander, Claudius Lysias, he cannot get an answer as to whether Paul is innocent or guilty. He tried to get it from the Jewish mob, but they were confused. He tried to get it from Paul's speech, but it was in Aramaic, and even if he had a translator, he still wouldn't have understood why the Jews were so mad at him. He tried to get it through beating, but Paul's a Roman citizen, so that didn't work. Then he took him to the Sanhedrin Council, the Supreme Court of the Jews, to see if they could come up with the verdict, but they started, turning on each other and shouting at each other to the point where Paul was in danger and he had to save them from the Sanhedrin Council. See, he still doesn't have an answer yet, and that is, of course, because Paul is innocent. And I say poor commander Lysias. Well, how about poor Paul? I mean, he is just so discouraged and probably afraid. And so we left off on Friday in verse 11 where Jesus is standing at Paul's side and he's telling him, take courage. He almost gets killed by the Jewish mob. And then even when he tries to explain to them his conversion and why he's preaching to the Gentiles, they don't give him a fair hearing. As soon as he says Gentiles, they want to kill him again. And then even when he goes to the Supreme Council of the Jews, the Sanhedrin Council, he gets smacked in the face right when he starts his testimony, and it's just clear that this is not going well for him. He gets in danger again of being torn into pieces by the Sanhedrin Council, just like that Jewish mob. And so there's just no justice anywhere Paul goes. His Jewish countrymen, their hearts are so hardened. It's so discouraging and disheartening for Paul. And so he needs the comfort of Christ. And again, I just want to emphasize, like I did on Friday, we've got to humanize Paul. We've got to realize he's not just some juggernaut of the faith that feels nothing and he just plows through with the gospel and he doesn't really let anything bother him and it just all rolls off of him. That's not true. Paul would have felt the same sort of awkwardness and tension that we feel when we share our views that are unpopular. Okay, nobody wants to be unpopular. Nobody wants to stick out like a sore thumb. That's unpleasant, right? The nail that sticks out gets hammered. Nobody wants to be that. Paul would have felt that social awkwardness of being sort of the black sheep, of being sort of the lone ranger here among the Jews with this view about the resurrection of Jesus. He would have also felt the peer pressure to conform and to adopt the traditional way that the Jews thought and to stay away from anything as crazy as Jesus rising from the dead or Jesus being the Messiah. Tremendous pressure he would have felt. And of course, tremendous fear he would have felt from the Jews, wondering, okay, if I say this, if I mention the resurrection, if I mention going to the Gentiles, what are they going to do to me? Are they going to rip my limbs off? I mean, that's what essentially the text said back in verse 10, that the commander was afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by the mob. And Paul had it even worse than we do, because when we're afraid, okay, it's usually just because we don't want people to think that we're weird. But we don't actually have the fear of getting beaten to death, okay, or being ripped limb from limb, or being stoned to death, like Paul had from these Jews. And now, in today's reading, it gets even worse for Paul, okay, because now the Jews are so serious about killing him. They made an oath that they would not eat or drink until Paul is dead. Think about that. They're saying us murdering Paul is more important than staying alive, than keeping ourselves alive. We would rather Paul be dead, okay, than us be alive. That is really, really strong. And of course, we read this and we know how it ends, and we know, they're not actually going to kill Paul. Okay, but Paul didn't know that. I mean, he did have the promise of Jesus. Jesus did say in verse 11, hey, you're going to go to Rome. So he did have Jesus' promise, but at this point, it doesn't look like that promise is coming true. How in the world am I supposed to go to Rome when I've got 40 Jews who are ready to kill me and to ambush me while I'm being escorted by the Roman guard? These Jews are actually willing to give up their life, not just because of the vow that they made that they wouldn't eat or drink, but also because in order to kill Paul, they're going to have to face a Roman garrison. However many are guarding Paul, they're going to have to actually, attack them, which means some of the Jews, they're ready to lose their lives. They're ready to be killed in an effort to kill Paul. That's how zealous they are. Remember, Paul said in Romans 10 that his Jewish countrymen have a zeal for God, but not in accordance with knowledge. They are so zealous. They want him dead. It's more important even than eating and drinking. It's just unbelievable. And so what's worse though, these 40 men, they actually go to the chief priests and the elders, and then the chief priests and the elders, they go to the Sanhedrin Council, and it seems like the Sanhedrin Council is fine with this plan. Again, this just shows how corrupt the Sanhedrin Council was at this point, that they're willing to actually go along with this murder plot, to go tell the commander, hey, bring Paul back down here to the Sanhedrin Council. And it's under the pretense that, hey, we want to examine him a little more closely. We want to ask him a few more questions. We're still trying to determine whether he's innocent or guilty. So, commander, why don't you go ahead and bring him down? And of course, the commander would be happy to do that. The commander would be like, okay, yes, finally, maybe they'll give me a verdict. Maybe I can find out whether Paul is innocent or guilty. So, of course, the commander would go along with the plan and bring Paul down to see them. But they're then going to arrange to where Paul's going to be ambushed on his way to the meeting place of the Sanhedrin Council, which would then get the Sanhedrin Council off the hook. It would make it look like the Sanhedrin Council had nothing to do with this because Paul got killed on his way there. So this is just from a human perspective, it's a really clever scheme that gets Paul killed, gets Paul removed from the earth, and also sort of exonerates the Sanhedrin Council, makes them look like they had nothing to do with this. But of course, they're just so wicked. Everybody in the story is just so wicked, except who? Claudius and Paul. And now we're going to see Paul's nephew here, which is, just a really interesting thing. It says in verse 16, the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. And, we're reading this, we're thinking, Paul had a sister? Wait, and is he on good terms with her? Is she a Christian? What about this nephew? How old is he? Where did he come from? Why is he in Jerusalem? Is he there, getting training as a Jewish rabbi or something in Jerusalem? Is he just there for the Feast of Pentecost? There's just so many unanswered questions, and Luke doesn't tell us about Paul's family, because we always wonder, okay, when Paul became a Christian, did he lose his family? Did his family just disinherit him or something? But here, seems like his sister and her son, Paul's nephew, are on Paul's side here, and at least his nephew is involved in some way. Don't really know how he overheard this conversation. Maybe just sort of stumbled upon, the conversation. Kids, he seems like a young man. Kids are kind of curious, and they see a group of adults talking somewhere in a back alley or something, maybe they want to get in on that conversation, just kind of see what's going on there. And he overhears this, and so he goes and tells Paul. And Paul tells one of the centurions under Claudius Lysias's charge. Remember, Claudius, he is a commander over 1,000 troops. A centurion is a commander over 100. So Lysias, he would be over 10 centurions. And so he takes the young man to the commander, and the commander, verse 19, it's interesting, says it took him by the hand. So this is what makes us think that his nephew was maybe a young boy. I mean, there's a question over the word young. What age was he exactly? But the fact that he takes him by the hand over privately is, a gesture of tenderness, and maybe the idea that this boy was really scared. I mean, think about it. If you're a young boy, even if you have this important information and you're sharing it with a Roman guard, if you're a young Jewish boy talking to Roman guards, the ones that are in charge of the entire empire. I mean, that's a terrifying thing, but it's almost like Lysias comforts him and takes him by the hand to show him, look, I'm on your side. I want to hear what you have to say if it involves Paul, which again is showing this amazing contrast between the utter insanity of the Jews and how they're not interested in reason or justice at all. And yet here's a Roman guard, a pagan, and yet he is concerned about Paul. He's concerned about truth. He's concerned about justice. And when he finds out about it, he tells the young man, tell no one that you've notified me of these things. He doesn't want this to get out because then they'll know that the plan is thwarted and all that. So we'll find out what happens in tomorrow's reading, what the commander decides to do. But let me leave you with this application. It's very interesting that even after Jesus appears to Paul and says, take courage, you're going to go to Rome, things got worse for Paul. They didn't get better. And that's what's interesting. When we pray to God, God doesn't promise us that He's going to just make our circumstances better, but what He does promise us is that He will be by our side. I love that. Back in verse 11, the Lord stood at His side. So God doesn't promise things are going to get better for us in this life, but He does say, I will be with you through whatever trials and challenges come your way, and also I will help you fulfill my will. So Jesus is at Paul's side, and He says you will witness at Rome as well. That is Jesus' will for Paul's life. I want you to go to Rome. So Paul can take comfort in knowing, even though this is tremendously scary, he's got 40 people trying to kill him, he knows, I'm not alone. Jesus is with me, and He's going to help me fulfill His will. And that's the same sort of comfort, even though I know we don't have the same specific instructions where Jesus says, okay, this is my will, that you're going to go to this city at this point in your life and all that. We don't have that same sort of specific instruction, but we can absolutely take comfort in knowing, even if our circumstances get harder, we can still have faith in God, that He will be with us through the trials, and He will help give us the strength to carry out His will and to still please Him, even in the trial. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 23, verses 23 to 35, and if you think about it, the Roman commander Lysias has been in a really tough spot ever since this conflict between Paul and the Jews started back in Acts 21. Because on the one hand, he can't punish Paul, because he can't find any legal basis to punish him. He thinks that he's innocent. And then on the other hand, he can't let Paul go because he knows the Jews will kill him. That's especially important because now he knows Paul's a Roman citizen, so he can't just turn this Roman citizen loose to be slaughtered by this Jewish mob. So this is a really tough spot, and things are getting even worse because now he hears a report that there's an ambush, that the Jews are going to want to jump the Romans, assassinate Paul on the way to the Sanhedrin Council meeting. And I find it interesting that even though he heard this from Paul's nephew, who was a little boy, presumably, he takes it seriously. You'd think he would maybe talk the little boy out of it and say, well, maybe you misunderstood the Jews, maybe you thought you heard them plotting against Paul, but maybe they weren't. No, I think by this point, Claudius knows the kind of people the Jews are. He knows how crazy this Jewish mob has been. He knows how crazy even the Supreme Court of the Jews, even the Sanhedrin Council has been. And so even just hearing this report from a little boy is absolutely credible. He takes it seriously. He doesn't put it past them at all. And he realizes, I've got to do something. I got to get Paul out of this city. So he's going to send him from Jerusalem to Caesarea. I'll put a map up there in a moment, but I think it's interesting. I think he sends Paul away for three reasons. One, to get this issue off of his plate. He doesn't want to deal with this anymore. He's just been in such a tight spot to where no matter what he does, it's sort of a lose-lose situation. He just wants to pass the buck, let the governor Felix deal with this because he doesn't want to deal with this anymore. Also, he knows this is the only way Paul's going to survive. Eventually, Paul stays long enough in this city, he's going to get assassinated. And he also knows this is the only way Paul's potentially going to have a fair trial. I mean, sometimes this happens in our modern day where there's a crime committed in a specific city and the town gossip starts. And even before the guy's trial, the whole town has sort of determined that he's guilty. And maybe the media's weighing in and the news anchors, they're talking all about the trial even before the trial starts. And maybe they sway the city against this person. So there are some cases where a lawyer will make an appeal to hold the trial in a different town because they know there's no way even if the jury is selected from this town, there's just no way this person is going to get a fair trial, even though they may actually be innocent. It's just the whole town is set against them. Same thing here with Paul. So he knows, I got to get him out of here. So he's going to send Paul with 500 soldiers, 470 to be exact, from Jerusalem to Caesarea. That's a 65-mile trip. And they're going to travel overnight, starting at 9 p.m., right, in the cover of darkness so that they'll be safer from attacks by the Jews. They're going to get Paul out of town as soon as possible, make an overnight trip to the city of Antiochus. That was a city that was built by Herod the Great, rebuilt rather, by Herod the Great in 35 BC, named after his father Antipater. And once they get to Antiochus, then only 70 soldiers will accompany Paul from Antiochus to Caesarea, because the first part of that trip, the first 30 miles from Jerusalem to Antiochus, is covering some really mountainous terrain. And anytime you're traveling through the mountains, it's much more dangerous from, robbers and from various attacks. And so once they're to Antiochus, they're past the mountainous region. They're far enough outside of Jerusalem to where they don't have to be as concerned about Paul's safety, though they're still sending 70 soldiers with him from Antiochus to Caesarea. I also find it interesting that Caesarea is the place where Paul stopped on his way to Jerusalem at the end of his third missionary journey back in Acts 21. That's where Philip the evangelist lives, and it's in Caesarea that Agabus the prophet stood up and told him he would be bound with chains in Jerusalem. And so I wonder just what they're thinking now, seeing Paul being brought in chains to Caesarea, watching the fulfillment of that prophecy. Well, he sends them with 470 soldiers, and in verse 24, they also provide mounts to put Paul on. So Paul is riding on a horse, presumably, and they bring him safely to Felix. Now, anytime you were sending someone to another governor, you would write a letter and say, hey, here's why this guy's coming. So Claudius Lysias, he greets Governor Felix. He calls him most excellent governor. That's interesting because remember, Luke's gospel, in Luke chapter 1, he addresses his gospel to the most excellent Theophilus. So that title, most excellent, was reserved for people that were Roman officials in some way. And the book of Acts is still addressed to Theophilus. It's just, interestingly, in Acts chapter 1, he's not called most excellent anymore. Some think that maybe he wasn't in his position of power anymore. But still interesting to see that title, most excellent, being applied to the governor Felix. Now, we'll talk more about Felix in tomorrow's reading, but for now, suffice it to say, he was a Roman procurator, which means he was a military governor in charge of keeping the peace. Just like Pontius Pilate was a Roman procurator. So here we have another Jesus and Paul parallel. Just like Jesus stood before Pilate, so too Paul is going to be standing before a Roman procurator. And Claudius's letter is kind of funny because he does tell the truth mostly, but then he sort of changes the order of the events to make himself look good and to leave out anything negative about himself that happened. It's also very self-centered. He uses the word I a whole lot in this letter. But notice, for instance, verse 27. He says, when this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him. Now that part is absolutely true. He did rescue Paul from that Jewish mob, but look at the very last part. Having learned that he was a Roman. Is that really when he learned that Paul was a Roman? No. He didn't learn that Paul was a Roman until he had Paul bound and tied to a post and was getting ready to scourge him. But notice, he conveniently leaves out that detail because that's going to make him look really bad. He also leaves out the detail of his confusion over who Paul was. He thought he was that Egyptian Jew that was going to lead a revolt against Rome. He leaves that part out too because, again, that's not going to make him look good. He, in this letter, wants to present himself as a hero. And I really care about the Roman citizens, and I'm all about justice and all that. And, I want to give Claudius some credit because, he has actually been concerned about justice. It's just, sometimes don't we do that? And it's unfortunate, right? We lie to sort of boost our image. And when we retell things, we like to leave out some of the things that make us look bad. That's what he's doing here. Verse 29, I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. That's such a huge admission here. Again, by a Roman commander, someone really high up in the Roman army, he's saying Paul is not guilty. Yes, he had disagreements about religious issues with the Jews, but he's no threat to Rome. There's nothing that he has done in violation of Roman law. And this is Luke, again, giving an apologetic for Christianity. Christianity is not anti-Rome. Verse 30, when I heard about a plot, I sent him to you, and I also told his accusers to bring their charges to you. Now, we don't actually see him doing that in the book of Acts, but he does do it because in tomorrow's reading in chapter 24, we'll see that some of them actually do go to Caesarea, and they, the high priest goes and they bring a lawyer to bring charges. So probably Claudius, he went to the Sanhedrin council and told them, I found out about the assassination attempt and I sent him to another town. And if you guys are really serious about charging Paul, you're going to have to go and present your case to Felix. Now, it's probably good that he kept half of his army with him, right? Remember, he's a commander over 1,000. He sends like 500 of them with Paul, but then he keeps 500 with him there in Jerusalem. That's partly wise just in general, because who knows what can break out in Jerusalem generally. But also, it could be that when he tells the Sanhedrin Council that he removed Paul and brought him to a different city, it could start another Jewish riot and a revolt, and they could try to attack Claudius and his men. So he's still got 500 soldiers there. Pretty wise move there. But obviously the Jews are not going to be happy about this. They're not going to be happy to learn that Paul was taken to another city, and yet they're still so zealous. They want Paul dead so desperately, they're going to make the trip. They're going to go up there and still try to bring charges against him. So verse 31, the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, they took Paul, brought him by night to Antipatris, but the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with them, they returned to the barracks. So these Roman soldiers are tough. I mean, they just made an all-night long journey, a 65-mile trip. Well, rather, it's 30 miles to Antipatris, but even 30 miles on foot. I mean, that's like a 6 or 7 hour trip. And now they're turning around and going back. Okay, so really, really tough soldiers there, making a long trip here. Verse 33, when these had come to Caesarea, they delivered a letter to the governor. They presented Paul to him. And the governor, when he read the letter, he wanted to make sure where Paul was from, because he wanted to make sure he had jurisdiction over Paul, that he actually had the authority to rule over this case. And it turns out that he does. And so he tells him, Paul, okay, I will give you a fair hearing. As long as your accusers come, I'll hear their case. Now, we'll talk more again about Felix in tomorrow's reading, but let me make this application. Look at the way Jesus is providing for Paul here. It's just amazing that back in verse 11 of this chapter, remember, Jesus said, take courage. And he was standing by Paul's side, and he promised him, you will be my witness in Rome. And now Jesus is protecting Paul and showing the providence of God, not in miraculous ways, but sort of in everyday ways. I mean, think about Paul's nephew, this little boy who just happened to be in the right place at the right time to overhear this conversation. And now here's this Roman commander, again, a pagan, and yet Jesus is using this man to protect Paul, to put 500 soldiers around Paul. You want to talk about protection and providence. 500 Roman soldiers escorting Paul. That is just an incredible act of provision on Jesus' part to keep Paul safe, to keep his word, to watch over Paul. And now I want you to notice in Luke 21. In Luke 21, Jesus, he was speaking to his 12 disciples who would go on to become apostles and be inspired by the Holy Spirit and all that. And of course, Paul is one of the apostles. And so look in Luke 21. He says this in verse 12. But before all these things, they will lay their hands on you and will persecute you, delivering you to the synagogues and prisons, bringing you before kings and governors for my name's sake. And it will lead to an opportunity for your testimony. So make up your minds not to prepare beforehand to defend yourselves, for I will give you utterance and wisdom, which none of your opponents will be able to resist or refute. So we also see Jesus' providence in giving Paul wisdom to where the opponents can say nothing. All they know is that, he's had a problem with the Jews, but there's nothing upon which to call him guilty because of the wisdom through the Holy Spirit that he's speaking. Jesus is providing for him there. And also notice, Jesus, even in these hard circumstances for Paul, I mean, this is an unpleasant thing that Paul's going through. It's a horrible circumstance. But even in this circumstance, Jesus says, this is an opportunity. I'm giving you an opportunity, Paul, to present the gospel to some of the most powerful people in the land. So I know yesterday we talked about how when we go through difficult circumstances, we can know that Jesus is with us and he gives us comfort and he gives us strength to get through it and to carry out his will. That's all true. But what I want to add in today's lesson is to say that sometimes the circumstances we find ourselves in, even harsh circumstances, are opportunities to share the gospel with more people, opportunities to grow and to become more Christ-like ourselves, opportunities to expand the borders of the kingdom so that the kingdom of God continues to just steamroll over Satan and all of the opposition unhindered, so that Jesus' kingdom wins in the end. And even in these terrible circumstances that we go through, Jesus can use us to open all kinds of doors, use our circumstances to open all kinds of doors that may not have been opened to us before. Really incredible what Jesus is doing here in Paul's life and what he can continue to do in our life if we'll just trust in his providence. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 24, verses 1 through 9, and we left off yesterday with Paul in Caesarea now, being held in Herod's praetorium. That's in the last verse of chapter 23. That would have been the governor's palace. That's where the governor, the Roman procurator, Felix, would have lived. There would have been many different rooms in this palace, some rooms even for holding prisoners, and even an area where he could, hear court cases. And you can actually travel to Caesarea today and find ruins of Herod's praetorium. I'll put up a picture here. You can see some of the ruins there. And then here's a shot of the place where Paul would have stood, giving his defense before Felix, and then later before Festus, and then later even Herod Agrippa when he comes. This is just, it would be so cool, right? To be able to go there and to stand there in the place where Paul was. Now, let's talk about the governor Felix. And in order to do that, I want to notice there's a proverb in Proverbs 30 that talks about how there are some things that the world just cannot handle because the weight of it is just too heavy. Things that the world just cannot bear up underneath the weight of. And one of those things, he says in Proverbs 30 in verse 22, is under a slave when he becomes king. Now, why would that be? Well, because if you're a slave in your entire life, you've been told what to do, and you've been forced to do things against your will, and you have no power and no say over anything in your life at all, and then you become king. Well, you can then go to an extreme level where the power goes to your head, and now you make everyone else your slaves, and now you make demands and dictates on everyone else. So here's why I'm bringing that up, because Governor Felix used to be a slave before he was governor. And he gained his freedom, he and his brother Paulus. And his brother Paulus had connections with the Emperor Claudius and later with the Emperor Nero. And because Paulus had those connections, Felix felt like he could rule in whatever way he wanted. And so he was a very, very harsh, very, very violent ruler. Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, he said that the governor Felix ruled with lust and cruelty, and he ruled as a king with the mind of a slave. So there's that Proverbs 30 connection. That's why I brought that up. I don't think Tacitus even knew about that verse, but even he recognized, look, when a slave becomes a king, that can be a very dangerous thing. When you give someone who had no power, ultimate power, boy, that is just a recipe for disaster. And because he was this Roman procurator, it was his job to keep peace, military peace in the land. And so he was just squashing Jewish rebellions all the time. And when he squashed those rebellions, he was particularly cruel about it, crucifying Jews, just going above and beyond to humiliate them. And so there's a lot of tension between the Jews and this Roman governor Felix. And in fact, it's largely the Jewish wars that break out later on in the 60s AD, which this is the year 57. So within about 10 years, some of those Jewish wars that started between the Jews and the Romans were caused because of rulers like Felix, who just fomented all of this rage among the Jews because of his meanness and his violence. Later, the next year, actually, in 58 AD, he's going to have one of the high priests of the Jews murdered. So really, really a bad guy here. And Paul's going to have to stand in front of this guy and try to make a defense for the gospel and hope to have a fair hearing. And so now verse 1, it's been 5 days since he left Jerusalem. Now the high priest Ananias has come down. And Ananias, he's a horrible person too, right? This is the one, remember, who ordered Paul to be struck in the face earlier while he was giving his defense back in chapter 23. And he's there. They bring an attorney with some of the elders. The attorney's name is Tertullus, and he would have been a Roman orator. And if you think about it, they're hiring this guy because, number one, they know their case isn't really that strong. Number two, Felix doesn't like the Jews. Okay, so if they try as Jews to come and make this case to Felix, he's not really going to care that much. Felix really is kind of sick of the Jews and all the rebellions and all that stuff. And so they're going to have a much better shot of hiring a Roman who would be able to present this case. Plus, he's going to be more of an expert in Roman law. Plus, he's going to understand the oratory tricks that were common, unfortunately, in the first century world, where you would use a certain kind of speech to sort of win the judge over to your side even before he heard the case. And that's what you see happening with Tertullus here. He's just flattering, he's just laying it on thick, really buttering up Felix. He says, verse 2, "Since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation." Now, notice the word providence there, that is usually the word assigned to the providence of a god. So he's talking to Felix as if he is a god. And by his providence, we've got so much peace in the nation. And it is true to some extent that he did help to bring peace by squashing these Jewish rebellions. But again, it's kind of a fake kind of peace because he's really creating more and more hostility with his reign among the Jews. But, Tertullus, he's not going to talk about any of that. He's just going to really butter him up and say, look, you brought so much peace to us, and we acknowledge this in every way and in every place. We're just filled with so much gratitude. Thank you so much. And he calls them most excellent. There's our respectful title, right, for the Roman official. But we know that your time is precious. We don't want to weary you with this case. We don't want to hold you up too long. But please, we beg you, by your kindness, please hear this case out. So again, just really flattering. If you have people like this in your life, especially if you're a boss or you're in some position of power, you need to watch out, right? Because if people are talking to you this way, it may feel really good, but they're hiding something. They are up to something. These are not truthful people. These are not people of integrity. And of course, he's laying this on so that he can present this case to Paul unfairly, sort of get Felix on his side, and then Felix hopefully will be able to rule in their favor, and he can make stuff up about Paul that's just not even true. And Felix might actually buy it because, hey, I kind of like this Tertullus guy. He thinks pretty well of me, and he's giving me very complimentary, and so, he's got to be right? I mean, how could he be wrong? How could somebody who thinks that I'm so great be wrong about anything? So, verse 5, here's the case. We found Paul to be a real pest. Some translations say a plague, and he stirs up dissensions and riots among all the Jews throughout the world. So there's really three parts to the charges against Paul here, and they're all very serious. Okay, first of all, he causes riots. And think about who he's saying that to. He's saying that to the governor Felix, who is a Roman procurator, whose job it is to squash riots. So Paul is he's charging Paul with reversing all of the peace that Felix has worked so hard to bring. Now Paul is going around stirring up problems. You're here to bring peace. Paul's bringing problems. Secondly, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. So he's a new religious leader, and he's inventing a new religion, sort of a new sect of Judaism called the sect of the Nazarenes, because Jesus was from Nazareth, and Nazareth had a bad reputation as it is. And so already there would be, sort of a question about Paul's character if he's leading a religion of people from Nazareth. I mean, that's kind of weird. So he's going to get Felix against Paul in that way. Also, it was kind of questionable in Roman times. You couldn't just go invent new religions without a sanction from Rome. You had to be approved by Rome to create a new religion. Now, this isn't a totally new religion, though. He's saying that it's a sect of Judaism, so maybe he could get away with that by Roman law, but this is not looking good for Paul. And then verse 6, he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him, which I mentioned earlier a few DBRs ago, that the desecration of temples was very serious to the Romans, and they took that so seriously they would actually allow the Jews to carry out the death penalty for people desecrating the temple, because they understood gods are important, temples are important. You can't just go defiling temples of the gods. And so these three charges are super serious. I mean, Paul should not survive this trial. I mean, Felix, if he was not interested in sort of hearing Paul's side, I mean, he could just kill Paul on the spot and be totally justified for it. Tertullus knows exactly what he's doing. He's not only, flattering Felix, but he's choosing three issues that the Romans would care a ton about. He doesn't talk about, this is a religious disagreement among the Jews and all that. No, because Felix wouldn't care. He's talking about things that Rome cares about. And of course, his charge that, Paul stirs up riots, that's only partially true. It is true he stirs up riots, but it's not his fault. It's the Jews that are the ones stirring up the riots because of Paul's teachings. And it is true he's sort of a leader of a religious movement, but this is, not another sect of Judaism. This is Christianity. And also, when he tried to desecrate the temple, they're lying about that, because he's still talking about him bringing Trophimus, a Gentile, into a restricted area in the temple. And Paul never even did that. Okay, so all of these things are not true. Now, in verse 6 down through verse 8, your text will probably be in brackets there, because that section of text was found in later copies of the New Testament, but it wasn't found in the earlier copies, which means it wasn't part of the original. Now, sometimes that makes people panic and feel like, oh, you're telling me the Bible's been changed, and how do we know what's been added and what's not been added? This should actually give you great comfort that these are in brackets, because it means we know exactly what has been added. Okay, anytime you see something in brackets in the New Testament, that's because textual scholars can absolutely tell what was in the original and what was not. And so that's actually a good thing to find brackets like this. It's also important to understand, just because it wasn't in the original text doesn't mean it didn't happen. Okay, Luke isn't giving us all of the details of Tertullus's testimony here. He's, just sort of giving us a summary. And so maybe the fuller version would have been circulating orally in the first century world, and people would have known more about what Tertullus actually said. And so some of the later scribes may have just inserted that in there. And if it is true, it's kind of funny, because he's saying, look, the Jews, he's associating himself with the Jews by saying we wanted to charge him according to our own law, right? The Jews, they were very reasonable. They really wanted to hear Paul out. But then Lysias, he's the one, the Roman commander, he messed it all up. He came in by violence and took Paul away from us and blew everything up. So again, he's just misrepresenting everything. He's representing the Jews as the reasonable ones, and Claudius Lysias, he was the unreasonable one, when obviously we know the truth was the exact opposite. And so he says, verse 8, look, if you examine Paul yourself, then you can find out for yourself that the things that I'm saying are all true, and the Jews joined in, and they're asserting the same things, and they're breaking the Ten Commandments. I mean, they are bearing false witness in court against Paul. They don't care. They don't care about serving God. They just want Paul dead. Now, let me leave you with this. It's a writing from a commentary that I thought was really, really insightful. And I'm going to read this because I want to emphasize again in today's reading the providence of Jesus. Not just right now in Acts 24, 1 through 9, but for the rest of the book of Acts as we see these trials going on. Just keep this in mind. He says, Jerusalem and Rome were the centers of two enormously strong power blocks. The faith of Jerusalem went back 2 millennia to Abraham. The rule of Rome extended some 3 million square miles around the Mediterranean Sea. Jerusalem's strength lay in history and tradition, Rome's in conquest and organization. The combined might of Jerusalem and Rome was overwhelming. If a solitary dissident like Paul were to set himself against them, the outcome would be inevitable. His chances of survival would resemble those of a butterfly before a steamroller. He would be crushed utterly obliterated from the face of the earth. So I just want to point out, Paul, he's in a position where he is potentially going up against Jerusalem and Rome, the most powerful forces in the first century world at that time. He should not survive these trials. He should absolutely be crushed like a butterfly by a steamroller, but it's because of the providence of Jesus. It's because Jesus is still with him, standing by his side, giving him utterance through the Holy Spirit that no one can resist, protecting him, keeping him safe. And I just want us to watch out for that and to remember that sometimes in this world, as Christians, we will feel like a butterfly against the steamroller of our culture and the popular ideas and the way that Satan has sort of turned our culture away from God. It's going to feel like we stand no chance against forces like this. But when we trust in God's providence and continue to stand up for truth like Paul does and to be brave and to do his will, the butterfly can actually conquer the steamroller. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 24, verses 10 through 21, and I want to make a point of application here at the start that we can sort of trace through every verse of today's reading, and that is Paul's calm under fire. Think of how infuriating it is to be falsely accused of something that you did not do. I mean, even as a kid, right? Your parents come in, they say, who made a mess in the kitchen? If your brother or sister did it and they blame it on you, that is infuriating. And it's even worse because it puts you in a position of potentially being punished for that. If the parents believe that false accusation about you, well, now you're going to be punished for something that you're totally innocent of. And I think that's even worse as an adult when you do your best to live in good conscience before God and men like Paul did. And you try to do the right thing and then people accuse you of being evil. That is absolutely infuriating, and it would be fearful. It would be terrifying too, because Paul is under threat of punishment here. He's standing before the governor of Judea who has the authority to kill Paul for this. And yet, despite how angry that would typically make a person and how fearful that would typically make a person, I think if I was in Paul's shoes, I would be just enraged at the Jews, and I'd be just shouting and yelling and saying, okay, they want to make accusations against me, well, let me dig up dirt on them and I'll make accusations against them and just turn it into a mudslinging thing to defend my integrity and my dignity and make the trial all about me. That's not what Paul does. He knows this trial is about Jesus. This trial is about the gospel. And so he stays calm and he's very reasonable in his approach. He's very respectful to the authorities, to Felix, somebody who's not a very respectable person. He still maintains his honor as a good Jew, a good Roman citizen, and a good follower of Jesus. It's just an incredible example. And remember what they accused him of. They said, look, he's a rioter. He's a ringleader of this illegal sect of Judaism, and he's a desecrator of the temple. And those things, again, if I'm in Paul's shoes, those things would infuriate me. And yet notice how reasoned and calm Paul is throughout this whole exchange and speech here. Verse 10, when the governor gives Paul permission to defend himself against these charges, notice how he starts. Knowing, verse 10, that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. So first of all, notice how different Paul starts than the way Tertullus started. When Tertullus started, it was with flattery and he's buttering Felix up. Most excellent. We're all so thankful for the peace that you've brought to our nation and all that. Paul, he's just very matter of fact here. There's no compliment. He just says, look, you've been governor for years now at this point. And number one, that's because Governor Felix really wasn't worth complimenting. He was a very cruel and violent person like we talked about before. Okay, but number two, Paul, he's not interested in playing games. Okay, he's honest. He's a straight shooter. And Felix has been governor since 52 AD. He'll be finished with his governorship in 59 AD, so he's got about a year and a half left. And I think Paul's point is, look, you've been governor of Judea for 6 years now. And maybe the implication, there's two implications. One, you kind of know how the Jews are. Okay, so some of the stuff that they're bringing up to you, and there's Jewish riots starting and all that, like that, I know that this shouldn't surprise you because you've already been governor of the Jews for 6 years. Also, I think Paul is trusting his wisdom to make the right call here because he knows this isn't his first rodeo. He has the wisdom to sort of see through these false accusations by the Jews and get to the truth. And he says, I cheerfully make my defense, which is amazing. He's not only not angry and not just infuriated and bringing revenge on the Jews and slandering them in response, he's actually cheerful to give his defense because it gives him an opportunity to talk to one of the rulers of the land about Jesus. That even though Paul is on trial here, and this whole circumstance is just terrible. From an earthly perspective, it's awful, it's unfair, it's unjust, this shouldn't be happening to him. Paul cheerfully makes his defense because this is an opportunity to teach more people about Jesus and to actually join myself to Jesus' suffering because Jesus, he too was put on trial falsely. His character was slandered as well, and Paul knows, look, I'm living my life like Jesus. I'm aligning myself with him, and so I'm cheerful even in this horrible spot because it gives me an opportunity to be a witness for Jesus and to spread the kingdom even to the highest levels of power in the land. Verse 11, you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. So Paul says, I was only in Jerusalem, it was only 12 days ago that I arrived there. So it's not like I had all this time to go around and gather riots and start some, some political unrest, some unpeaceful, groups of people together at my side. I was only here 12 days ago. There's not enough time for me to do those kind of things. And also the idea is, it only happened 12 days ago, so it's pretty easy to investigate. There's a lot of people around from 12 days ago that you can ask them about what happened, and they'll tell you. Verse 12, neither in the temple nor in the synagogues nor in the city, they didn't find me carrying on a discussion or causing a riot at all. Paul, for the most part, was by himself. He wasn't with huge crowds of people. He was by himself in the temple, and he wasn't actually going around preaching the gospel while he was in Jerusalem. Because remember, that's not his purpose. His purpose is to go to the Gentiles. Jesus told him in that vision, the Jews in Jerusalem are going to reject you. So it's not like Paul was going around and just stirring up trouble in Jerusalem by preaching Jesus and getting all the Jews angry at him. That's not what he was there for. On that particular trip to Jerusalem, why was he there? It was to bring the financial collection from the Gentile churches to the Jewish Christians there. And he went to the temple in part to celebrate the Feast of Pentecost, but also to engage in that purification ritual to help those Jews fulfill their vow and show solidarity with his Jewish countrymen. And so he says, I wasn't causing a riot. In verse 13, nobody can really prove to you that charge is true. And he says in verse 14, I do admit, I am teaching the way. I am, a leader of a religious movement in a sense. Okay, it's called the way, and he probably gets that from Jesus saying, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. He also said, narrow is the way that leads to eternal life. It might also be hearkening back to Isaiah. In the later chapters of Isaiah, God says, I'm going to open up a highway for the righteous, and the righteous will take this highway back home to their God. And so this is the way back home to God is through Jesus. But Paul clarifies, this is not some separate sect of Judaism. It's actually a fulfillment of Judaism. It's actually the culmination of Judaism. So that me and the Jews, Paul's saying, we serve the same God. We follow the same law and the same prophets. But it's those law and the prophets that actually point to Jesus being the way. And so Judaism is not, Christianity is not some illegal religion that's just totally different from Judaism, has nothing to do with Judaism. No, it's the actual end goal of Judaism. And he says, therefore we have hope in God because of the resurrection. And most of the Jews, they believe in a resurrection as well. But Paul's implying that the resurrection is only possible through Jesus' resurrection. He is the way home. And so he's finding common ground with them. Like, we all believe in the same God. We all believe in the same law and in the same prophets. Hey, the disagreement comes with who Jesus is and what this way is all about. And he says in verse 16, I do my best to live with a blameless conscience. That really helps when you're under fire and people are falsely accusing you. It helps to know that you're innocent because you can challenge them and say, look, the accusations that you're bringing against me, how do those match my character at all? That's not how I've been living my life. Those accusations they won't stick to you very well because they won't match the life that you've been living. And Paul says, verse 17, after years I came to bring alms to my nation. He's talking about the Jewish Christians there that he brought that financial collection to. Now what's interesting is that's really, I think, the only place where Luke in the book of Acts actually mentions the financial collection for the saints in Jerusalem at the end of Paul's third missionary journey. He just doesn't really mention it much in Acts. We get information about that from Paul's letters, but here's the only place. And Paul's saying, look, I've honored the Jewish people by bringing them a collection. He says, when I was in the temple, I was making offerings there. And again, he's referring back to after that purification ritual, they would offer sacrifices to, again, be an act of solidarity with his Jewish brethren. And he says, when I was there in the temple being purified in that purification ritual, there was no uproar, there was no crowd, there was no mob there. What happened was there were Jews from Asia who came down, and they falsely accused me of bringing a Gentile into the restricted area. But here's the mic drop moment for Paul in verse 19. The very people who started this whole thing are not even here to make their case. And so this entire trial is just based on hearsay. Yes, there are some members of the Sanhedrin Council who are here, to argue against me and to falsely accuse me or whatever, but those Sanhedrin Council members were not there when the original problem started. And so this is all hearsay, which is a serious problem. You can't waste the Roman court's time with hearsay. You need eyewitness testimony. And yet the very ones who were the eyewitnesses to the thing that started there in the temple, they're nowhere to be found. Okay, why? Well, number one, because they know their accusations wouldn't stick, right? They know there's nothing to their accusations. And two, they just went home after the Feast of Pentecost, which again shows how evil these people are. That the very ones that started this accusation, started this whole process, they don't care what happens to Paul. They don't even know that Paul was later brought to Caesarea and that Paul's standing trial before Felix. They don't know. They don't care. They just made up this accusation because they hated Paul and wanted him dead. And then they just went home like everything's fine. It's just horrible how evil these people really are. But Paul's saying, look, they're nowhere to be found. They should be here presenting their case, but they're not. And even the Sanhedrin Council members, who he talks about now in verse 20, he's saying, let them tell you what I did wrong in the council meeting. Paul didn't do anything wrong in the council meeting. They actually did Paul wrong. The high priest had Paul slapped in the face in that council meeting. The only thing Paul did wrong, per se, is to bring up the resurrection of the dead. Okay, and that's what got them arguing with each other because they can't agree among themselves about whether there's a resurrection, the Pharisees and Sadducees, and then they wanted to tear Paul apart on that basis, and that's why Lysias ended up saving Paul from the council meeting. So his original accusers aren't there. Okay, the Sanhedrin council member, they have nothing upon which to accuse Paul of any inappropriate conduct while he was on trial in their council. Paul's character, doesn't match up with these accusations, and Paul has lived as a good Jew. He has honored the law. He's honored the prophets. He serves the same God the Jews are serving. He honors the temple by going and presenting offerings in the temple. So there's absolutely nothing about any of the false rumors that Paul hates the Jews. I mean, he brought money to his own nation. He brought money to Jewish Christians. Of course he doesn't hate Jews. Okay, so there's just nothing. Paul is like Teflon here, right? Absolutely zero accusations can stick. And again, it's another connection with Jesus. Even though Paul is not sinless like Jesus was, there's still this sense in which he's totally innocent of any of the charges that they brought against him, and so nothing can stick. And again, great application here. Watch how Paul handles it, because when we're slandered and people start slinging mud against us, our temptation is to lash out, start slinging mud against them, defend our character, make everything about us, instead of realizing, what is my goal? My main goal is to reach them with the gospel. So they may not like me, they may not think well of me, but I want them to think well of Jesus. I want them to know the truth. And so when I respond to people who hate me and who level false charges against me, I've got to stay calm. I've got to stay very reasonable. I've got to be collected in my responses. That's going to be the best opportunity, to reach people, because if they see that you start flying off the handle, well, then they're going to say, well, look, the accusations must be true. He's an angry person and he's bitter and all that. But if you just continue to love people, to speak from the heart, to speak the truth, to continue living in all good conscience, and to keep the main thing the main thing. That's what I love. Paul, he just wants to talk about the resurrection. That is the core issue here, the resurrection of Jesus. Sometimes in our conversations with people, we get off on rabbit trails, religious topics that don't really matter as much. We want to bring them back to the core of the resurrection, because it's the resurrection that makes Christianity unique from every other religion. It's the resurrection that proves Jesus is king. It's the resurrection that proves everything Jesus said was true, and it's the resurrection that gives us hope of being resurrected with Him in the end. Let's stay calm. Let's pray to God when we're under attack, to have the attitude and the heart of Paul and to say, look, not only am I not filled with wrath against you, I cheerfully relish the opportunity to give this defense of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Hope that's helpful. I'll see you tomorrow. Today we're in Acts 24, verses 22 to 27, and Felix is in a really tight spot here because Paul's defense is irrefutable. He's innocent, so Felix can't punish Paul. On the other hand, he can't let Paul go because it will make the Jews angry at him. Now here's the thing, Felix, he didn't used to care what the Jews thought. In fact, he made a career out of making the Jews angry with him. He was cruel and violent in crushing the Jews and their riots and all of that. But that's because his brother Paulus, P-A-L-L-A-S, his brother Paulus had great favor with the Emperor Claudius and then later the Emperor Nero. And so Felix felt like he had a political shield and he could just rule however he wanted with whatever cruelty he wanted over the Jews, and his brother would be a shield to him. He would vouch for him with the emperor and be fine. But 2 years prior to this, in AD 55, his brother Paulus fell out of favor with the emperor. And so now he's lost his political shield and he's worried, if I let Paul go and the Jews are angry with me for that, they can go report this to Rome, and Rome can take away my governorship and they could even take my life. And so he's in such a tough spot. Now he just wants to buy time. And he says, well, look, verse 22, I'll send for the commander Lysias and I'll talk to him about this matter. But the thing is, he already knows what Lysias thinks about Paul because Lysias wrote him that letter. Back in the last chapter, in chapter 23, verse 29, Lysias says, I found Paul to be accused over questions about the Jewish law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. So he already knows what Lysias thinks. This is just a tactic to sort of stall because he's so trapped. Now what's interesting is he knows about Christianity. Verse 22, he has more knowledge about the way than most rulers did. That may be because there are Christians right there in Caesarea. That's where Philip the evangelist lives. Other Christians live there as well. That's where Paul, he visited those Christians on his way back from his third missionary journey. And also, Felix is the governor of Judea, and before that, for a few years, he was ruling over Samaria as well. Well, the church started in Jerusalem, and then it expanded out to Judea, and then into Samaria. So he's very familiar with Christianity. He knows more than anybody how innocent Paul is. But again, he can't let him go. So he puts him in prison to keep the Jews happy. And at least, though, he allows Paul some freedoms. He allows his friends to come and see him. And that's just so huge because this means Paul doesn't have to face this horrible trial alone. I mean, this is just such an unfair, unjust situation. Paul shouldn't be here. And yet, gratefully, he can have the comfort of his Christian brothers and sisters coming to see him, to bring him food, to bring him clothing and supplies. This is Jesus continuing to take care of Paul. Remember, Jesus said, take courage. I'm with you. Okay, you are going to go to Rome. And at this point, it doesn't seem like Paul's going to Rome. How am I going to Rome when I'm in prison here in Caesarea? And yet Jesus is still providing for Paul, taking care of, meeting his needs. And it's giving these Christians an opportunity to serve Jesus by serving Paul. Remember in Matthew 25, Jesus said, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When I was naked, you gave me clothing. When I was in prison, you visited me. These Christians, in serving Paul, are actually serving Jesus. And it's just awesome to see that Paul, he's going to have the comfort, not only of the Christians there in Caesarea, but also from Luke down in, he's still in Jerusalem, presumably, other Christians in Jerusalem, other Christians in other parts of Judea and Samaria, right, that know of Paul. They're going to come and help him and make sure he has whatever he needs. It's a beautiful picture of comfort in the face of tragedy, and Jesus continuing to provide for Paul. Verse 24, some days later, Felix arrived with Drusilla, his wife, who was a Jewess, and sent for Paul and heard him speak about faith in Christ Jesus. Drusilla was married to another person, a king of Syria. But Felix actually seduced her and convinced her to leave him and come and marry him. So Felix is her second husband, and Drusilla is Felix's third wife. So this is an adulterous relationship. They have no business being married. And Drusilla, just a little bit more background information here. Drusilla is the daughter of Herod Agrippa I. Herod Agrippa I is someone that we met back in Acts chapter 12, who killed James. And he put Peter in prison. And then God punished him by sending a plague on him. And, he was eaten by worms, essentially, from the inside out. And we didn't actually cover this chapter in our daily Bible reading because that chapter really wasn't about Paul. But that happened around 44 AD. So it was 13 years before this. Drusilla was only 6 years old when that happened. She's about 19 or 20 now in this text. And Felix's name in Latin means happy. We see that in the Spanish word feliz, like Feliz Navidad, Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas. Our English word felicity captures that. And the reason I'm bringing that up is because Felix convinced Drusilla to leave her husband and said, look, I will make you happy. All right, I will live up to my name and I will give you all of the happiness that you want. And so he sort of swept her off her feet. But there was another reason why she married Felix, and it's because Drusilla was a knockout. She was like a 10 out of 10. That's why Felix wanted her so bad. She was just so pretty. But she had a sister named Bernice who was not pretty at all. She was like a 3 on the scale. And because of that, her sister Bernice was jealous of her and made her life miserable and constantly was just persecuting her and mistreating her. And so in spite against her sister, Drusilla said, I'm going to marry Felix so that I can have a higher position over my sister, to just sort of, twist the knife a little bit into my sister. So there's all sorts of like adultery and pettiness and false seduction and all sorts of unrighteousness going on with these people. These are not good people. And so when they call Paul in to tell them about the faith in Jesus, I love how Paul doesn't pull any punches. Because if you think about it, it would be tempting for Paul to water down the gospel in the hopes of getting on Felix and Drusilla's good side so that they'd let him out of prison. Right? Paul could have come out and said, look, your name is happy. Your name means happy. Well, that's perfect because Jesus just wants to make you happy. He died on a cross for our happiness. And he could have said that. And Felix would have been like, oh, that's so great. And maybe Felix would have let him out. Okay, but Paul's not interested in that. He only is interested in the truth and in pleasing Jesus. So he tells them about righteousness, how to truly be righteous in God's eyes, and how we can't be righteous on our own based on law keeping. And I think Felix and Drusilla, they would have related to that and realized, yeah, we've broken a lot of God's laws. We've not been living righteously at all, especially Felix. I mean, the guy, again, so unrighteous, so cruel, so vicious in his attacks against the Jews. And then Paul says, we need self-control. You can't just live however you want. We have to live for King Jesus. Once God makes us righteous by the sacrifice of Jesus, well, now we live for him. We no longer live, right? It's like Galatians 2:20 where Paul says, it's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live, I no longer live to, please my flesh, okay, but to please Jesus, the one who died for me, gave up his life for me. And again, this is just hammering on their behavior because they've not been very self-controlled at all. They're very impulsive. They're living their life based on their feelings and whatever feels good in the moment. And then Paul really scares them and says, look, the judgment day is coming. We're going to have to stand in front of Jesus and give an answer for the life that we lived. And we're going to be sent to hell if we don't repent. And we don't know how Drusilla reacted to this, but Felix, boy, he is absolutely terrified. This has absolutely convicted his heart. He knows he is not ready for the day of judgment. He knows he has not been righteous at all. Okay, and so unfortunately, he doesn't actually repent. He tells Paul, come back later. Let's talk more about this later. he missed his moment. Sometimes it's like if you don't act on the moment of your conviction and you put it off, there's almost like a hardening that happens over your heart. And it can be too late if you miss the opportunity that's right in front of you. Because interestingly, he's going to call Paul back in and talk to him regularly, over the coming years. And yet he's still not going to respond to the gospel. Why? Because every time he puts Paul off and puts off obedience, he's putting another callus over his conscience. Another callus is building over his heart to make it harder and harder to respond each time. And, he's got another sinister reason for keeping Paul in prison. It's not just to please the Jews. It's because he thinks Paul might give him money and bribe him to get out of prison. He thinks the longer I keep Paul in prison, the more impatient Paul will get with this whole thing, and the more he'll try to, get his way out of prison with money. And if you think about it, back in verse 17 of this chapter, remember Paul said when he came to Jerusalem, he came bringing alms to his nation. I came with this big financial collection. So Felix may have heard that and thought, hey, this guy's got access to a lot of money. He's got some resources, and he's hoping Paul is going to bribe him. But Paul's not going to do it. Paul absolutely refuses to bribe this man, even if it means sitting in prison for 2 years. Can you just imagine how frustrating and difficult that would be for Paul? Paul is a man on the move. Even before he was a Christian, he was on the move, hunting Christians down. And then once he became a Christian, he's on the move, traveling all over the world. And now he's just stuck in one location, can't go anywhere. And yet, he's still faithful enough not to water down the gospel just to make Felix happy, not to ask Christians to gather some money together to engage in some sort of corrupt political move where he bribes his way out of prison. He's not having any of that, even if it means sitting there for 2 years. And again, just think about how much over that 2-year period, Paul would have been sort of wondering, okay, Jesus, where are you? You said I was going to Rome. When am I going to Rome? It's been 2 years and I'm sitting here in Caesarea Philippi, or not, it's not Philippi, it's Caesarea Maritima. And this happens for 2 years until Felix is replaced by Festus. Now we'll talk more about Festus later, but what ended up happening is the very thing Felix feared happening did happen. He put down he started getting very violent against the Jews. There was some tension between Jews and Gentiles, and he started putting down some revolts. And the Jews absolutely went and lodged a complaint against him for that to the Romans. And the Romans recalled his governorship. They removed him from office, and in fact, he was about to be killed for it. But Paulus still had just enough favor with the emperor to talk Nero out of killing him. And so instead, he was banned to Gaul for the rest of his life. Just sort of a life banning away from society and all that. So Felix got what he deserved, and eventually he's going to stand on the day of judgment and get what he deserved for all eternity for his, not just his cruelty over his career, but his unjust treatment of Paul the apostle here. Let me leave you with this application. We need to be ready when people ask about the faith of Jesus Christ. Let's just have something prepared. And this gives us a beautiful sort of 3-point outline. If somebody says, hey, what's faith in Jesus all about? Righteousness, self-control, the judgment to come. And what I love about it is that it doesn't water the gospel down. It talks about sin. And we've got to find creative ways of showing people, look, none of us have been righteous. We've all broken God's law. None of us have lived self-control. We've lived for ourselves. And we're all going to face God on the day of judgment. And it's sad that even though we're not even in prison, right, and we're still tempted to water down the gospel. Just because we don't want to make people mad or we don't want it to be awkward or whatever, but we have to talk to people about sin when we teach them about the gospel. Sometimes we just want to say, Jesus has a plan for your life, and Jesus wants to make you happy, and Jesus wants to fulfill you, and all of that. And it's like we're leaving out the conviction of sin. Remember in John 16:8, Jesus said, when the Holy Spirit comes, He will convict the world concerning sin and righteousness and the judgment to come. And that's what Paul is doing here. He's staying faithful to just preaching what the Holy Spirit wants him to preach, which is about sin and righteousness and the coming judgment. And this is just a beautiful 3-point outline when somebody asks you about Jesus. It's not just he makes us feel good, he gives us the hope of heaven. Okay, that's true, but people have to appreciate the problem first before they can appreciate the solution. We've got to talk to them about the problem of sin. And here's a creative way to do this. This is what I started doing at Cranes Park. It's working really well. It's getting people to actually stop and have a conversation because it's interesting to people. I asked them, do you think that Hitler is in heaven or hell? And almost everybody says hell. And I say, oh, well, why is that? And, they'll say things like, well, he was a crazy murderer or whatever. And what I asked them is, okay, and do you think when God judges Hitler that he would use the laws of the United States, the laws of Germany, or like his own laws, like God's own standard? And almost everybody says God's own standard. And so I ask them then, what if God used his own standard to judge us? How would we fare? And sort of, get them to answer, do you think you would go to heaven or to hell if God were to judge you by his law? And if they say hell, well, then you can ask, does that concern you? And sort of bring them to an understanding of what Jesus did for them on the cross to save them from that condemnation. If they say heaven, well, then sort of explore that. Well, why is that? And have you ever broken any of God's laws? And what I like to do is take them through some of the 10 commandments and say, hey, have you ever told a lie? God says don't lie. And if they say, yeah, I have lied, yeah. I say, hey, God says don't steal. Have you ever stolen anything, big or small? God says don't make anything more important than him. And if you've done that, then God says you've committed idolatry. Have you ever committed idolatry? And so then you sort of get them to see, wow, yeah, I'm a liar, I'm an idolater, I'm a thief, okay, I've lusted after people in my heart. And so then you sort of ask them, okay, then by your own acknowledgement, you've acknowledged that you've broken God's laws and you'll be guilty. And so do you think God would not punish you for that guilt? Do you think he would still let you into heaven? And just get them to sort of wrestle through that, because you got to get them to appreciate sin and the fact that there's a day of judgment coming in order for them to appreciate the good news of the gospel. Hope that's helpful. Have a great week, and I'll see you on Monday.